Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Writers Toolshed. It's Richie here and delighted to welcome back after a bit of a sabbatical, JM.
Hey everybody, I'm back.
How are you
Um,
doing?
I've been better. So it's been a kind of a hard couple months for me. Uh,
Yeah.
had some family issues and also some real life office issues. So it's been busy and stressful, and I haven't had a lot of time to focus on writing and other things like this podcast. But it's nice to be back and to get into a more regular routine, and we've got a good topic today.
Yeah, we do indeed. It is magic systems. So, and I'm not a big fan of magic. I don't use a lot of it in my stories. I tend to focus on characters and apply real world problems to them, but just in a fantasy setting because anything can happen in a fantasy setting. That's just what I love about it. But you've used magic systems in your stories, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of magic, and this is the Fantasy Writers Tool Shed, so it's probably a topic that we were gonna hit here eventually. Um, I think you have the right idea about what fantasy is and what people what appeals to readers as far as fantasy goes, and that's characters. But there's always room for action and
Yeah.
monsters and flashy explosions. So
Just give your characters powers instead. Makes it more
yeah,
interesting, doesn't it?
I mean superhero genre is a subgenre of fantasy in my opinion, and superhero powers, unless you're getting deep into genetics and talking things like genetic mutants like X-Men, generally speaking, a lot of superhero fiction is fantasy. It's magic. It's not explained.
Yeah. And when I say I don't like magic, I say that in the context of writing rather than reading because a lot of my favorite fantasy books have had big magic themes running through them. Uh, Magician by Feist. Magic in the title. That's one of my favorite fantasy books. So I I do like magic, but I just don't really use it enough in my stories.
Yeah, I think fantasy as a genre, if you think back to um, things like Tolkien and the Fairy Queen, the original kind of fairy lore and things like that. There was always a magical element to it, and
Yeah,
and that element of the unknown and the mysterious and the unexplained.
yeah,
So I think maybe to get started, it would be worth retreading some old territory and defining fantasy again, at least where we're coming from as far as what angle we're approaching and what we think fantasy is. And when I define fantasy or explain fantasy to readers and to other writers, I like to use the Star Wars versus Star Trek comparison. And I think
yeah,
that lays it out pretty good. Um, a lot of people think those two often get lumped in together into science fiction, but really Star Wars really isn't science fiction per se, and there's a good
yeah,
reason for it. Um, in Star Trek, everything is explained. It might not be strictly scientific, but you have a warp drive that works with a warp bubble that runs off of antimatter and has a dilithium chamber and all these different mechanics and
yeah,
details on how the system runs. That's science fiction. Science fiction is you are explaining the processes and how things work. Fantasy is
yeah,
the opposite. You don't explain how things work. So in Star Wars, for the most part, if you go just based off of the movies and the core series, they don't really explain how the ships fly. They don't really explain how light speed works. They don't, and then they don't explain the force. The force is just magical power that exists in the universe that certain characters have the ability to tap into. Now, in the one of the prequel movies, they added the midichlorians as a scientific explanation for where the force came from, and there was just uproar. The fans were not getting it. They didn't want the force explained. They just wanted it to be there. And
Yeah.
interestingly enough, the movies have never gone back to midichlorians. They've never gone back to explain the force. It's just something that is there and exists. And that's really the kind of the defining characteristic of fantasy is the unknown element. Things are not fully explained. And
Yeah.
magic tends to be one of the big components of that. Is there's a power that characters can tap into, but it isn't explained in detail how they do it. You don't go into their genetics, or you don't go into the technology that allows them to exploit this power. It just kind of is there, and it exists, and it's used. Um, and this allows the author to focus on something else. The authors in
Yeah.
fantasy focus on character and issue, whether that's a class examination or a racial examination, or um, I saw an article recently that looked at the Lord of the Rings and the role of Frodo, and that Sam's struggle was all external. Sam
Yeah.
was the character who was physically combating the world and struggling and facing the external threats, and Frodo was all this internal struggle about
Yeah.
facing your inner demons and struggling with depression and overpowering despair. And the reason why Lord of the Rings was so powerful and had such a fan reaction is that you have these two characters that are doing two different things that are synergizing. Sam
Yeah.
is dealing with the external obstacles, and Frodo is dealing with these internal obstacles. And depending on who you are, you relate to those different heroes. And people with depression, suicidal tendencies, going through grief, things like that, they respond to Frodo because Frodo is dealing with that same sort of inner despair that's just kind of crippling. It was a really good article. I'll try to
Yeah.
find it and
Sounds fantastic.
link it with the podcast. That's what
Yeah.
fantasy does, is examines characters and those types of things, where sci-fi is typically plot driven or concept driven. Sci-fi is
Yeah.
focused on the technology, how it works, and how that technology affects things. iRobot is all about the robot and the robot rules and how robots integrate into societies. I can't even
Yeah.
remember who the characters are in iRobot. I know the three rules, right? Like the three robot rules is the robot can't ever hurt a human, and those types of things. Like that's what you remember from iRobot, and what you remember from Lord of the Rings is Frodo and Sam and Legolas and Aragorn and the King Returned, and all those character driven plot, story points.
Yeah.
So that's how I would distinguish fantasy and science fiction. So one big element of fantasy then is magic, this undefined power.
Yeah.
And interesting, another interesting crossover between fantasy and science fiction is Arthur C. Clarke and his third law, the very commonly quoted phrase, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, which just kind of
Interesting.
means if you don't explain it, it's magic. Um,
Yeah.
Typically in fantasy stories, magic takes the form of superhuman power, whether that's um, the ability to throw fireballs or to fly or um, other sorts of things, but it also might take the form of supernatural creatures or um, other supernatural type elements,
Enchanted weapons, armor.
weapons, enchanted, empowerment of weapons and equipment.
Yeah.
Um,
That's what our whole stories are about, isn't it? Magic daggers.
yeah, um, and dragons and unicorns and that are divine. And um, I think the critical point though is once you've once you've explained it too much, it's no longer magic, it's technology or it's biology. So I remember
Yeah.
reading a book. I think it was called Dragon of Ashen Stars, where it's like a biography of a dragon, and it goes into detail a lot of the. It's basically part of it's kind of this biological analysis of like the life of dragons, like how they're born and where they come from, and all this different stuff. And at that
Yeah.
point, it stops being magic and it starts being it's just
Yeah.
biology. It's just a different biology.
It quite literally loses its magic.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, so you mentioned earlier there, JM, which is always something that interests me, just purely for the aspect of conflict, is the relationship between magic and religion. So, I mean, when we look at religion and fantasy, it generally exists. Like it's true, you know, gods and goddesses do generally exist. Whereas in our world, there's no basis if it does or it doesn't. Like it all depends on faith and what you believe and the extent in which you believe it. Um, but in fantasy, everything's sort of real, like gods exist and all that. So if you've got a magic system, what relationship does religion have within your world? Because if you look at humanity and civilizations all throughout time, there's always been some kind of belief system, some kind of religion, generally centered around the sun, because that is the life giver. But you see the likes of, say, communities based around rivers, things like that. There's a lot of like, or seas, oceans. There's a lot of like belief in gods and goddesses to do with things that give them life and support them throughout their lives. So, I mean,
I
do
think
characters view religion and differently if magic exists, or are they separate or interlinked, or do they conflict with each other? I mean, I think there's plenty. If both do exist in your world, there's plenty of different ways you can toy around with that conflict between the two. If one exists, it could be interlinked. But what do you think? If you come across anything like that in fantasy?
well, just thinking religion in general. Um, it's not all gods and goddesses, right? I mean, even the sun gods is kind of a, a Western Central Eurasian type thing. If you go further east, you have a lot of animism and totemism, and also in early North America, where uh, like you said, rivers, like everything, like the rivers, the lakes, the hills, they all have some sort of spiritual element to it, some sort of entity. Um,
Yeah,
and in the Far East, with animism, it's the animals and the trees and everything. Um, and you kind of get that in fantasy with elves and those types of characters. So yeah, religion is a huge topic, and it doesn't have to be just gods and goddesses. It can take all sorts of different forms. And like you say, often in fantasy, the it's it's true. The beliefs are true, and this is the shorthand explanation sometimes for like where the magic comes from. Is
yeah,
that, oh, it's there's gods and goddesses, therefore
the
they
chosen
do
one.
powerful things, right?
Yeah, convenience. Well, like we said, we don't need to explain magic. So
Well, we'll discuss that
yeah,
later. Just how much do you need to explain it, whether or not you need to explain it. But if you explain, yeah, if you explain too much, you definitely there's a there's a line where you cross where it's no longer really fantasy if you're explaining too much.
yeah,
So, like as we said, a lot of times magic in fantasy is drawn from religion or from the divine. I guess would be the best way to clarify it.
yeah,
And it's not explained in terrible detail, other than that these characters or these sources are divine. And I think Tolkien is another good example. Um, so in Tolkien, the wizards who have this unexplained magical power and can do these things are these kind of demigod type characters that are. And I'm not a Tolkien expert to lay out exactly how everything hashed out in the Silmarillion and all that, but
Yeah.
um, the wizards are some sort of demigod characters that are descended from the original godlike, the Valar, I think, are the original kind of semi godlike characters that were created for the world. So there's this whole creation story with the gods, and then the kind of the divine children, and all of the kind of the magic power, and Sauron, and the his ability to craft the rings, and the wizards, all are descended from that divine um, lineage, and that's where all
Yeah.
the power comes from. And that's very common to see in a lot of fantasy. I think is that magic is divine. And when we talk about magic systems, I'll get into that more. But you had an example as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I really like how George R. R. Martin tackles religion in Game of Thrones. I think the way he does it's full of conflict, and it's quite grey in terms of like it's not really pure, it's not really evil, but it's definitely manipulated in a way that it sort of reflects what religion is like in reality, I suppose, in some respects. It can be abused by the wrong people for manipulative reasons. So
Yeah, and I
I
think
think it,
I think the
yeah,
interesting
sorry.
thing about the Game of Thrones religion in Game of Thrones is I've I watched the show, and I played some of the games, that some of the official games and whatnot. Um, it never struck me as being confirmed. So they have their religion, but and there's hints that some things might be divinely caused, but it's never seems to be really confirmed. And you've actually got the competing religions. You've got like the
Yeah.
what is it, the seven or the eight?
The seven, yeah, is the sort of Westeros one, and then you've got like the Lord of Light and all that
Yeah,
jazz.
so you have the two competing. They both can't be right. They're
Yeah, I don't know that that was never really explained. We haven't got that far in the books, I don't think. When
yeah.
obviously spoilers here, so turn it off if you don't want to know. When Jon Snow dies and gets resurrected by the Red Witch, um, I mean, is she's called a witch, so you assume she's got some sort of magical ability. So was it the magic that was doing that, or was it the Lord of Light? I mean, that never really went anywhere in the TV show. You only hope that it might get some kind of an explanation in the books.
Yeah.
But
Or was he even completely dead?
I mean, he got
Yeah, he
some
got
bowels, I
tanked a
think.
bunch of times.
He was pretty dead, I think. And, yeah, it was quite interesting. Again, it's a little conflict. I mean, what I like about Game of Thrones is it there's magic's not clear in it, is it? It's there's these ancient beings who had some sort of magical abilities. They've all sort of died out, but they've passed on. I mean, like the White Walkers and stuff like that. But I suppose it's like and dragons, of course, but it's like magic's on its way out. It's like the last echoes of magic. Um, but that's what I quite like. I like
Yeah,
the
and it's not
gritty
really
realness of Game of
explained
Thrones. Yeah,
where it comes from. The dragons are the dragons are just kind of there. They come from eggs, but and they yeah, it's like they've well, there's always been dragons like in
yeah,
in the in the history, but where it's not explained where they come from. And I don't think the White Walkers like are fully explained what makes them tick, and where their power is coming from, other than it's the ancient magic, right?
yeah. Hopefully, a lot will come in the books.
But do you
Yeah.
want it to be fully explained?
In some
That's
respects,
a
I just
big
like a
question,
sort
right?
of not like in detail, just so at least you know what's going on. That, I'm watching the last few series, like Game of Thrones. I was like, oh, what the bloody hell's happening here?
Yeah,
It's like no character development at
they
all.
got past the books and didn't know what they were doing at that point.
I know, but you just know exactly what happened. It's like George R. R. Martin told them what happens in the books, like in terms of plot points. But what is lacking is the character development to make any of the plot points compelling.
Yeah.
It's a shame. But now the books will always be better, hopefully, if he finishes them. So
Well, I think it's going to turn out. You know, the Game of Thrones TV series is going to turn out a lot like the new Star Wars movies. Uh, my understanding is George R. R. Martin gave them a lot of plot points of what's going to happen, but they didn't take them all. Right? They didn't do everything that Martin said. They kind of went off on their own, the same way that um, George Lucas has provided Disney a bunch of ideas about where Star Wars should go, and they went in a different direction. So I think the books
yeah,
are going to end up in a different place than the series did, just because those two they didn't literally take his plot and apply it to the TV show. They did their own thing.
and spectacularly failed. Only joking.
Yeah,
It wasn't that bad. It wasn't. I
was
still enjoyed it.
spectacular though. Lots of good CGI battles.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I enjoyed the battles. So
So
talking about magic systems, then back to the topic at hand. Um,
so how much do we need to explain? And
yeah,
it, so a lot of I see a lot in Facebook kind of fantasy writer groups and in other places. You got new writers who are new to fantasy, and one of the big questions they always ask is, how do you make a magic system? As if it's something that's required of
yeah.
all fantasy novels. Like
I
um,
don't know one. Never used one.
it's yeah, it's not something that's required, and it go you this whole the whole point of this podcast, this episode, is really how much do you need to explain. So on the one end is the magic system, so the mechanics of how magic works in a particular world, and that is the far end of explaining a lot. And I think for me, one of the best examples is Dungeons and Dragons, and I think fantasy as a genre has a lot um, owes a lot to Dungeons and Dragons for making the genre popular. They basically took Tolkien fantasy and popularized it by uh, making it more kind of pop culture, more focused on action and magic and all those flashy elements, whereas Tolkien is really more of a literary story about people and struggle, and the magic and everything kind of happens is it takes a is more of a supporting role. Well, in Dungeons and Dragons, magic is all upfront. And then with the success of Dungeons and Dragons, you get all these fantasy movies and video games and board games and comic book spin-offs that are all kind of derived from that. And I think that's where a lot of people in my generation kind of got in touch with Tolkien fantasy, with elves and dwarves and all that kind of thing, is that kind of evolved form that it took with Dungeons and Dragons. And in Dungeons and Dragons, it started as a game. So obviously you've got to define your rules and define your mechanics of how things work. So in Dungeons and Dragons, there's two basic forms of magic. There's divine magic and there's arcane magic. And divine magic comes from the gods, and that's more traditional type fantasy element. So a little bit more like Tolkien, a little bit more like the Fae and mythology. The Greek heroes are all demigods and have some sort of divine heritage. So on the one side, there's divine magic, and if you want to use divine magic, here's how you do it. You got to pray every day, and you get your spells and things like that. And then there's arcane magic, which is a different mechanism for using magic, which involves chanting words and using uh, physical elements to cast your spells, and using your hands to create uh, symbols with physical movement, and those are the kind of the mechanics of the arcane magic. So
Nice.
that's kind of on the far end of how much you need to explain, whereas on the other end is traditional Tolkien, where how exactly does Gandalf um, you know blast the Balrog, and where does the Balrog come from is less
Yeah.
less explained. um, but you had some examples of magic systems that you like too, right?
Yeah, I mentioned at the start that although I don't write with a lot of magic, a lot of my favorite fantasy books have had magic essential to the story. And I was thinking of back to some of my favorite books. I was just trying to get a few varied examples together of different magic systems, and just to give you an idea of like the range of possibilities and the different approaches you can take to building your own system. So the first one I wanted to talk about is by a writer called James Barclay, he's written quite a lot actually, but the series I'm talking about is the Chronicles of the Raven. So it's about a band of mercenaries who obviously are in a situation in which they have to save the world. So part of their crew are two elves, and they're proficient magic users. And uh, the way it's used is they have like battle. They call them battle mages or battle elves, um, and they can create defensive spells or they can create offensive spells. They don't know every spell. Like different mages use different. So like one would do offensive spells and the other one would do healing spells or defensive spells. Um, and there's a limit to how much they can use. They grow fatigued and tired, and they've got to rest and sort of meditate and recharge their abilities before they can use them again. So that's a good idea. Joe, if you want to put a limit on magic, because you've got to sort of create some sort of boundaries, otherwise you can just blast your way out of any situation. Um, with Barclays one, if you limit the magic, it's makes it more interesting then, because you can create situations in which like the the conflict's at its like peak because you've got no magic left. The injured or wounded or they've lost people and they're on the knees. So how are they going to get out of this situation? So yeah, that I really like James Barclay's System of Magic. That's a good one to check out. The second one is a popular one, also very unique. It's Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. So this one is all to do with like the sources of magic and where does the power come from, and it's all to do with metals. So um, the people who can mistwalkers, I think I can't. So apologies, I can't remember what they call them. It might be called mistwalkers, but the people who have Kelsey and Vin. Sorry, Vil's one a character from my book. Vin, she's the main protagonist. They consume metal or pieces of metal, and from that they get different kinds of abilities, and different metals give them different skills and whatnot. So that was quite unique and novel. Um, one last one is by Adrian Tchaikovsky, who wrote the Shadows of the App series, and he sort of tied magical abilities to different races that he created, and all the different races are related to insects. So the wasps were the main antagonists in the story, and they could fly and they could fire fireballs, things like that. And mantids, for example, they were a really cool character. They could like they're really fast and they've got like weapons like blades, sort of growing from the arms and the forearms and stuff like that. And yeah, it's really really unique and cool, and it's all tied down to races and stuff like that. So yeah, they're three very varied magic systems there, which just goes to show the potential that you've got. There's no sort of limit to what you can do with a magic system.
Well, yeah, and I think there there are three very different systems, but they all seem to be three systems very much in a kind of a Western tradition, right?
Yeah,
And I think the idea that magic has some sort of natural source, whether that be natural life or metals or some sort of biology, and then also the magic user getting fatigued as being the weakness, right? So one big thing you need to have, you can't just have, you know, Superman flying around and being invincible. There's no drama there, right? There's no suspense. So
yeah,
you
no
have to have
conflict.
something like kryptonite that will weaken Superman so that there's a chance that he might die, and you can be, you know, hanging on the moment for a moment. And with Western style kind of magic systems, it's always, and we've done the same thing with of metal and magic, is you use magic and it fatigues you. It takes some toll on your physical body, um, and that's kind of the Western tradition of magic. But if you watch like anime and stuff like that, you can see that there's some very different ideas about magic and spiritualism in Eastern cultures. And one of the big ones that I think isn't used as much as it should be is the kind of the Shinto Taoist paper spells that you get in like Japanese anime, where the shaman writes a spell form on a piece of paper, and you can do things with that. So in the real world, that's used like uh, people will hang these pieces of paper with an inked character on it on their windows to like keep bad spirits out and things like that. But
Yeah,
in the kind of the Japanese anime fantasy genre, they take that and they turn it into totally different things where like the shaman has all these paper spells that they've prepared, and they throw a piece of paper in the air and it becomes a fireball, or it becomes some sort of other magical effect.
that's cool.
And so the limit of their magical power is how many of these spells did they prepare ahead of time, and did they prepare the right ones,
Yeah,
um, which is kind of similar, I guess, to how the arcane magic system works in Dungeons and Dragons. It's all pre-prepared. So yeah, they get fatigued because they're running around and they're doing physical things, but the magic isn't necessarily fatiguing them. The limit of their magic is what they've prepared ahead of time. Um,
yeah,
whereas Western magic is a lot of more uh, instinctive and spur of the moment type usage, but it creates mental and physical fatigue.
yeah,
Um, I've done. I know you haven't really delved a lot in magic in your books, but I've written two books that have two very different magic systems. The first one is my Of Metal and Magic series, Call of the Guardian. So already in Of Metal and Magic, in the world of Soria, we've created a kind of the source of magic as as being divine, as is tradition,
yeah,
and you have dragons and unicorns, which are these kind of semi-divine beings, and their being and their essence and their remains are where magic comes from and how human beings tap into magic. But I from that baseline in Call of the Guardian, um, the main hero can tap into magical power using the mechanisms that we have built in our fantasy universe. But his magic is also limited by what I call the call. So the call is this kind of resonance that happens when people are in danger. So people who are feeling afraid or threatened, there's a resonance in the magical ether that the main character, the hero of Call of the Guardian, can hear, and that empowers him. So not only is there the general kind of, he uses magic and he becomes fatigues because there's this kind of, it's almost like a, you know, Newton's law type reaction. You know, for every action there's an opposite reaction. So every use of magic, there's a opposite toll on the magic user, is one foundation. But also he can only be empowered when there's people around him that are in trouble and that are feeling distressed. So if the tide of battle turns and now, you know, morale on his side is soaring, then his magical power drops because that crisis is gone, and what he needs to tap into is no longer there. So
cool.
interesting limitation that I get to play with. And then the second book is my original side novel, In the Valley of Magic. And that whole book, I'm going to try, you know, not spoil it too much, but the point of that book is figuring out, where does magic come from? So it's very much integral to the story. Can you hear him?
Is that a cat?
Shut up.
Telling you to shut up.
Okay. The whole point of that book is actually examining the origin of magic in that particular world. I'll try not to spoil too much, but that book has a very particular magic system and mechanics of magic. So in getting to discovering the source of magic, one of the things that I had to do was explain how magic is used and how people interact with that power. And so how magic works in the Valley of Magic is, it's all mental. So the wizard or the spellcaster imagines certain things in their head, certain imagery in their head to create magical effects, and it's all based off training. So there isn't one particular, you know, symbol or icon that means, you know, a fireball. It's all what the spellcaster has trained themselves to picture in their head in order to create that effect, and it all comes through training. So
cool.
For one character, a fireball might be the color red for fire, and you know, circle for an orb, and you know, the image of flying might create the effect of creating a fireball. So it's typical, very kind of flashy, typical video game type magic with fireballs and explosive power and things like that. But the mechanism for how they do it is more, it's more internal.
Yeah. Bit like magic system with emojis.
Yeah, that's maybe if I did a modern spin-off of that book, it would all be emojis.
You could do a spell book and it'll just be emojis.
But the spell book doesn't work in that world because all the imagery is internal to that person and how they've trained themselves to create an effect. So it's just rote training over and over again. And there's a magic academy that, in one of the flash fiction stories that I wrote, there, you know, one of the characters is in a class, a magic class, and they're like, you know, the best way to think of fire is to think red because fire's red, and the best way to think of healing's green. But it's not a rule that they're not saying you have to do it. You know, it's whatever works for you.
Yeah.
And then when you get to the end of the book and you understand how magic works, then you realize, oh, that's why. That makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, cool. We'll have to read it and find out.
So I think going from there, so we've talked about different magic systems and different ways that magic is used, but I think the big question for fantasy writers, and this goes back to the guy posting on Facebook about how do I make a, directly, how do I make a magic system? It begs the question, do you need a magic system? Do you need magic? How much do you need to explain, and how much do you need to integrate magic into your fantasy for it to be fantasy? And what do you think, Richie?
Yeah. I always think when it comes to revealing bits about your world, I always come back to world building advice, which is always less is more. Tease them, make them want more. I mean, it didn't work for Star Wars. I mean, look how big that was. People were happy with no explanation, really. People, I mean, you just need to give them enough that it makes sense in their minds. You don't have to go into the bloody origin stories of magic. You just need to explain how it works and what it can do, the limits and whatnot. But again, it just depends on what kind of story you want to write. If you want to write a really magic heavy story, you do whatever you want. It's just make sure it's clear. That's the main thing. Sometimes these magic systems can get really convoluted. I think I always come back to world building advice. Just make sure it's clear, consistent, and just reveal what's necessary. Don't just splurge loads of information that we don't need to know about. Just at that point in the story, tell us what we need to know. Don't indulge too much. It just seems to be the way writing, particularly fantasy writing, is going. Is at one time we were given the entire backstory of why the hobbits gave presents to each other on each other's birthdays. You know what I mean? in modern stories, it's purely like it's like I say, character driven. So it's we only explore the issues central to the character and what's going on around them. And that's not to say that all stories need to be like that, but that's the kind of stories I like, and that's the seems to be the way the genre is going. So it's my
Seems
2 cents.
it definitely seems that what sells is less distraction, right?
Yeah,
Um, if the lead character is not a magic user, you don't need to have a scene in your book with a wizard explaining how magic works, because the character doesn't need to know, right?
yeah,
Um, and I mean, I think the bottom line is, I think the big question is, do you even need magic per se? Like, do you need to have some sort of supernatural power that your characters can tap into? And the answer is no. I mean, you can have fantasy just having magical creatures, supernatural creatures, dragons or ghosts or other sorts of beasts and things. That's fantasy enough. You don't necessarily
yeah.
have to have power. And then when you do have magical power, you don't need to explain it beyond what the characters need to know to function and to, you know, to fulfill
You know what?
the needs of the narrative.
Yeah,
I think
most
it's more. I think
definitely.
it's definitely riskier to go further into detail and into mechanics and explanation. You're gonna get distracted from focusing on the character and the narrative. Um,
Yeah, I think the takeaway is proceed with caution. Don't overdo it,
I think
otherwise
that
you risk losing the magic.
if you're a new fantasy author, I think the question to ask is not how do I make a magic system? It's do I need magic? I think is the question you need to ask. And
Yeah,
if you,
it's not a requisite, is it?
yeah, if you answer the question, do I need magic with yes, for whatever reason, your lead character is a wizard, or uh, the story is about some sort of divine legacy or whatever, that's when you proceed to the next question is, well, how much do I need to explain? And then after that is, well, if I need to explain it, then how can I make a magic system? And then that's the way making a magic system, coming up with a magic system is, doing a lot of research and seeing a lot of examples and looking into, magic and spiritualism in the real world. Like I said, there's fundamental differences between kind of Western magic and spiritualism and Eastern magic and spiritualism. Maybe the Eastern or the Native American or the Polynesian type mysticism is more appealing than Western fantasy kind of tropish magic at this point.
Yeah, whatever works for you at the end of the day, isn't it? So play around, have a research. It's not necessary. If you don't want to have it, you don't have to have it. But I think we've covered a lot of points there, and hopefully you've found it useful. That's the main thing. I'm no doubt we'll come back to magic systems on this podcast in the future. Yeah, because I
Maybe
think
in
you
the
guys.
future we can do we can create one from scratch on the air or something.
Yeah, that'd be a good challenge.
Then we can license it out.
Yeah.
You can rent our magic system for your novel.
Oh, so thank you very much for tuning in today. It's been great to have JM back. Just feels like everything's back to normal, the way it should
Yeah,
be.
it's getting there. Hopefully, yeah, hopefully life will balance out here shortly. I also
Yeah.
might have a mini episode lined up here, so you'll be getting more of me uh, in the future.
Yeah. Yeah, and we won't go into too much detail now, but the pair of us have got a few very exciting things planned for the next few months ahead. And we can't wait to share it with you and tell you more about it, but we just can't say much more than that at the moment. Um, but yeah, so thanks very much for tuning in. As always, please follow us, subscribe, give us a like, all that jazz. Please tell everyone about us as well. That's the main thing. Spread the word.
And
And
if you
yeah.
really want to dive into magic systems, you can pick up my book In the Valley of Magic. It's still on sale on Amazon.
Yeah, yeah, do it. You'll enjoy it. I enjoyed it. So thanks very much, guys. We'll speak to you next time. That's from me, Richie.
Yep, and that's it from me, JM.
Bye bye.